1950s, Britain was struggling to adapt to a new era. Its reign as a global power had passed. Foreign policy humiliation in the Suez Crisis had toppled Prime Minister Anthony Eden, and the country's diminished role on the world stage had been exposed. As sovereign, Elizabeth was a beacon of stability in such uncertain times. But, as ever, Margaret's role was less defined.
She was an important adjunct in the 50s and early 60s to her sister, where she took on royal associated duties that freed Elizabeth up to do other things.
Margaret became a very glamorous figure. She also started smoking in public, bringing out the characteristic elegant long cigarette holder, and was charged with doing things like opening hospitals, smashing bottles of champagne against ships in a very glamorous manner.
Princess Margaret does have the reputation of having been a party girl, which of course she was. But we also have to accept that she was also a very hard-working member of the royal family.
In 1957, Margaret became president of the new Royal Ballet, a reflection of her lifelong passion for theatre and the arts. Nevertheless, she was nearing 30 and still unmarried. In 1959, Peter Townsend wed a young Belgian woman with a striking resemblance to Margaret. Just months later, the princess surprised many by announcing an engagement of her own. Anthony Armstrong-Jones was not the usual royal match. He was from a wealthy background, Eton then Cambridge, but he had no fine title or lands. He was a photographer.
Margaret was really enjoying the fruits of some of the major social changes starting to appear in this era. She was starting to keep very non-aristocratic company, quite bohemian company.
Lady Elizabeth Cavendish gave a dinner party in February 1958, which Tony Armstrong-Jones was one of the guests. And Princess Margaret had never met him before.
I think the influence of Anthony Armstrong-Jones was really to introduce her to normality. She was smuggled on the back of a motorcycle, disguised in a headscarf and dark glasses, to Armstrong-Jones' rented flat in Rotherhithe Street.
The princess said that it was the most romantic setting, and this was their bolt hole. It had a bay window overlooking the Thames. You looked to the right and there were the docks, and you looked to the left and there was a bend in the river, and you saw Tower Bridge and St. Paul's Cathedral beyond it. And at high tide, she said, swans would look in.
Their relationship was kept secret, so the country was stunned in February 1960 when Princess Margaret's engagement to the photographer was announced. Their wedding was in Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May 1960. It was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television. Millions tuned in around the world.
I think as a sister, Elizabeth was very happy that Margaret had been able to find a man she loved. I think as Queen, even though Armstrong-Jones was not ideal, was not a society man at all, he was, given Margaret's status as a rebel, really about the best that they could hope for.
Princess Margaret at that time was hugely popular. Everything she did made news. Everything she wore made news. So when she married, this was an occasion of great celebration.
Everybody was frightfully pleased with the sort of glamour of the wedding. And Princess Margaret looked wonderful, and he was a talented photographer, and it all seemed very modern and just how it should be.
The whole thing really was a very, very beautiful occasion. I mean, I can remember being a young schoolboy, totally enthralled watching this on the television.
Despite the excitement of that day and the two children born in the years that followed, the marriage soon became troubled. Mutual infidelity, drugs, and alcohol strained the relationship to breaking point.
I think that two worlds very much collided. Armstrong-Jones's bohemian, free lifestyle, and Margaret's unwillingness to dispense with, shall we say, all of the accoutrements of wealth and prestige and fundamentally royalty.
It was a very curious relationship, and although she was a princess and he wasn't a royal, I think that he had the upper hand. As things got worse, he was better at being nasty than she was.
Within 3 years of them having married, the cracks were already appearing.
The British press, with the emerging tabloids and the red tops, were becoming much more hungry for scandal and also, crucially, much more prepared to print scandal. Margaret was always the sort of go-to person for a royal scandal.
He had much loyaler friends, it seems, than she did, because he always seemed to come out of it, as far as the public was concerned, rather well, whereas she didn't.
Press deference to royalty was a thing of the past. Newspapers covered the breakdown of Margaret's marriage in gleeful detail. It was far from the only change in Britain during Elizabeth's reign. By the time of her Silver Jubilee in 1977, old-class divisions and social taboos were fading. The British Empire had transformed into a commonwealth of independent nations. The crown, Elizabeth, was the thread tying them together. As she guided the monarchy and nation through crisis and triumph, her sister Margaret was left without a role. She may have been an icon of the 1950s and 60s, but as the decades passed, her star waned. Like her father, Margaret was a heavy smoker for much of her life. Like him, she would suffer the consequences. From the late 1980s, her health began to decline. After several severe strokes, she died on the 9th of February 2002. She was 71.
For the relationship between Elizabeth and Margaret, there was this bond of love between them that had been there from the time Margaret was born to the day that Margaret died.
At her funeral, the Queen perhaps showed the most public emotion we have ever seen on a public occasion, where her eyes, I suppose, really betrayed the sadness she was feeling.
To have to come to terms with the death of your younger sister, who you could expect certainly to live with you into old age, is very hard.
When the princess died, that was quite a blow to the Queen, followed, as it was 7 weeks later, by the death of her mother. She is said to have said her biggest nightmare would be losing her mother and her sister. And that, of course, is what happened in 2002.
Princess Margaret's life, though privileged, was a sad one in many ways. Margaret was a flawed and often troubled woman. She did not have her sister's weighty responsibilities, but nor did she have the certainties.
I think that what Margaret did was really stretch at the limits of what it was acceptable to do for a woman in her position. This, I think, created a precedent and also much more breathing space for future younger royals to enjoy, even in the celebrity infested world that they inhabited, something more approaching normal lives.
If she had a few tiresome aspects, well, who doesn't? I would actually say she was probably a pretty supportive member of the royal family. She did do her bit. On a day-to-day basis, her life was very full. She had very interesting friends. She went to the ballet, she went to the theatre, she read books, she was alert and interested in things. She loved music and wasn't boring.
She, too, helped to modernize the monarchy, to bring it into what at that time was the 20th century.
The monarchy has shown itself under the Queen's leadership to be flexible, adaptable, and something that can be seen as both a stable institution and something that can change and reflect new values.
I think more than anything else, for Britain's own conception of itself as a post-war nation, she was definitive.
She has been criticised, her family have been deeply criticised, and by just being herself and keeping going and being straightforward, it's absolutely paid off.
The world they ended up inhabiting when they were a lot older was one where the social class system had died and the mass celebrity and media age was dawning. In the case of Margaret, you could say that she was very much a product of that age that was unveiling. In the case of Elizabeth, she managed to be its architect.